Thank you very much, Chair. So I've got a couple of questions about follow-ups on growth and the longer term, and then something on universal credit. So the OBR projects very low economic growth in the last years of your forecast, 1.3, 1.6 and 1.7. And we've talked earlier on about the longer term impact of Brexit of 4%, 2% with COVID. And then a recent report by the IMF states that the coronavirus crisis is set to bring more longer-lasting damage to the UK economy than any other country in the G7. The fund on Tuesday said that, just to recap, its global forecast showed that while most advanced nations would return to the economic growth expected before the pandemic struck, Britain's economy would still be 3% smaller in 2024. Can you just, each of you, talk us through what you think the long-term prospects of this country's economy is, just for our constituents to understand better what the future holds for us? The Chancellor painted a picture of optimism in his budget, but the reality seems very different, in my view.
Maybe I can say a few words. I'm sure my colleagues will have thoughts as well. I guess the way I characterise it is that we've made it through the pandemic with, fortunately, in our view, relatively light scars on our economy compared to the kind of scars left by the financial crisis in 2008 and previous shocks that the UK has faced. And that is partly because the vaccines have been so effective in allowing our lives to go back to normal, and government support has been so effective in keeping the economy alive in the meantime. But all the challenges that we faced before the pandemic, sort of low productivity, an aging society, with a workforce which is not keeping pace with the number of people who are in retirement and drawing a pension, are all still there and remain to be tackled. And so in that sense, there was nothing coming out of the pandemic which led us to radically revise our view of the long run productivity of the economy, apart from the sort of level effects that we saw as a result of lower levels of innovation during the pandemic itself. So the sort of productivity challenges that we had pre-pandemic, the skills challenges that we had pre-pandemic are all still there for us to confront.
We've talked about the impact of Brexit as well. We've had much deeper lockdowns, which has, in previous evidence sessions, we've heard quite a lot about the difference in how Britain's been impacted by the pandemic. Are we entering a period of decline in the long term in this country? Or are we likely to meet the gap in productivity, which seems to have eluded us in the past? Perhaps, Sir Charles, you might want to comment.
I wish I knew the answer to that. The one thing I would stress here is the overriding importance of productivity in this. The scarring from the pandemic and Brexit are small compared to the shortfall in productivity relative to the pre-financial crisis trend. So it's something like 20%. That's huge, absolutely huge. We don't fully understand the sources of that productivity slowdown. As I said earlier on, it's partly an international phenomenon. It's not a purely UK phenomenon. But also we know the UK's productivity, even before the financial crisis, was lower compared to some of our international peers. So ideally one would address both the slowdown in productivity to get dynamism up, if you like, but also try and address some of the issues that have led to our poor relative productivity performance. That second one is actually probably easier because we understand more about the sources of that, which is to do with relatively low educational attainment of the workforce, relatively low investment compared to some other countries. It's also partly connected with managerial practices. We have a relatively long tail of underperforming companies. Our best companies are really good, they're world class, but there's quite a long tail of underperformers. There may also be some structural elements in there as well, in that we have a relatively more service intensive economy and a bit more consumer intensive, and that has some marginal effects as well. Now, this is not something that you can solve overnight.
And we haven't seen the investment that, for instance, the catch-ups are recommended to the government in education. So that suggests that it's going to be an even deeper impact on the economy on top of what you've just said.
Well, I mean, certainly if there are lasting effects on the education and skills of the young people coming out now, that will have lasting effects over the rest of their working lives. So the thing about these investment things, and it goes back to an earlier question about the public what account we take of public investment, and Richard made the point, well, it doesn't have much effect over the few years of our short-term forecast, but of course the effect that it does have is around for a very long time, whether it's public investment, investment in the workforce, and so forth. So I do think that is the key going forward, to try and address those sorts of shortcomings.
Mr. King, did you want to come in on this point? Because I've got one other, and then my time's going to be up.
I'll add one very quick thing from my past as an official rather than an OBR. The thing that I always found very striking was that the long tail of management performance, it looks very similar to the long tail of educational performance. At the best, it's very good. The other thing is on investment. I was always struck that in the UK, investment is low internationally, whether you look at public investment, business investment, or residential investment. So there is something holding back investment in general, rather than specific to a particular type of investment.
Okay. Just one more question on universal credit. In your forecast, you state that you've not made any adjustments to the numbers of hours worked in the economy as a result of the reduction in UC taper rate and the increase in work allowances, because any induced employment among these groups is likely to be at relatively low numbers of hours a week and at relatively low hourly pay, and therefore negligible relative to the economy as a whole. How did you come to this judgment?
Shall I answer that? Or? Okay, there are empirical studies of the response of different segments of the workforce to changes in benefits and so forth. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies in particular have done quite a lot in this space using micro data on individuals. The evidence from that work suggests the biggest effect here is for basically families with children, lone mothers and couples with children. It has a relatively low effect on single males, females, and so forth. If you apply the elasticities from that work, it leads you to get an hour's effect of something like plus 0.05 percentage points, so very small. The effect on potential output is even smaller because most of the extra hours worked are in relatively low productivity occupations. So it's sort of de minimis for our forecast. That said, of course, it matters quite a lot for the welfare of the individuals who benefit from the reduction in the universal credit taper and so forth.
Although millions won't benefit because of the
removal
of
yes,
20,
and
20
that raises another issue actually, that the changes in benefits and the national living wage and so forth, they have different effects on different people. So some of the people benefit from the changes, others are made worse off, and it's therefore difficult to make a single statement which encompasses them all.
Thank you. My time's up.